And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now to continue to talk about the situation in the Middle East is Dr. Jonathan Dworkin. Dr. Dworkin is an MD. He's a board certified specialist in infectious diseases, and he's licensed to practice medicine in a couple states. He's an associate professor at Columbia, and he has spent a lot of time in Kurdistan, a lot of time with the Kurdish people over there, first in 2006, and then again recent visits, and we want to talk to him a little bit. He's been writing about that extensively in recent weeks, and we wanted to talk to him about it. Dr. Dworkin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for the promotion to Columbia faculty status.
Well, that's what it says here, but from my lips to God's ears, I guess, as they say.
No doubt shares some common ancestry with me, who's a Columbia professor. But I'll take the promotion.
Oh. All right, okay. It's a long story. My producer just said in my ear. So, okay. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
But you are the Dr. Dworkin who has been spending time with the Kurds and writing
That's correct.
writing very well about it. And I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit. And you've written movingly and inspiringly about the situation there, about their struggle over the years, and of course in recent weeks, just there on the border. But my question to you, I guess to start, would be, you've said there's no American strategy in Kurdistan. I want to talk about your experiences there, but I guess the fear that here's the conflict I always have, is that I'm so inspired by the courage of these people, and yet I don't see deeper military involvement as making sense. So as you're watching American actions, I want to concentrate on the Kurds, but to start, as you watch American actions in recent weeks in that part of the world, what's your reaction?
That's a fantastic question. I think probably some of your listeners may not be aware of exactly where the Kurds are, so it may make sense to start a little bit with that. Mm-hmm. My first real moment of awareness in Kurdistan came in 1991 when I was a boy, and I saw images of Kurdish refugees on television fleeing into the mountains. This was in the wake of the first Gulf War, and there was a Kurdish uprising at the end of that war in response to the American attack on Saddam Hussein, which was then crushed as the Americans left. The end result of that, which was not very appreciated at the time, was a no-fly zone, which in a way was sort of an afterthought in the American discussion. But underneath that no-fly zone emerged the first real modern experiment in Kurdish self-governance. And I became aware of them again around the time of 2003, 2004, in the run-up to the second Iraq War. And, for your listeners, just to visualize this a little bit on the map, the Kurds live in the border area between Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria, not exactly a great neighborhood. And they've always relied on the fact that they're a hill people to maintain a certain amount of independence. So that's the geographical context. Socially, Kurds tend to have a more syncretic form of Islam, so they contain many minorities within themselves, and they are a minority in that area. Yazidis, Jews, Zoroastrians, Al-Haq, Sufi, etc. They've established women's rights in their areas. Women work as professionals. Women work as soldiers and leaders in government. One of the things that really strikes you when you visit their area is that when you talk to Kurdish people, there's no real theory of Kurdish exceptionalism. There's no chauvinism. They're patriotic for sure, but they're not nationalistic in a racist kind of way when you meet with them. They're very curious about the outside world, intensely curious, I would say. And that was one of the first things I noticed when I started visiting in 2006. So that's kind of some context as to who they are. And I think it's a liberal group of people, by and large. And that's something that I think Americans often fail to appreciate. We talk about the Middle East as if it's nothing but an endless series of warring factions. But here in front of us are the real Muslim moderates, the people who have adopted women's rights, who have protected minority rights in their area, and have attempted to establish some kind of democratic governance. So we should feel some sympathy towards them as Americans. And I'm very lucky that I had the opportunity to become friends with them.
Right, and I think it's important to emphasize that, to say, for example, that the Sufis who are being imprisoned in Iran coexist peacefully with Sunni Muslims and in a place in the Kurdish areas, or as you mentioned, the Zoroastrians or other minority groups. So, and it's a relaxed, from what I understand, a relaxed form of Islam compared to some of the more doctrinaire forms, by and large. So what's your reaction when you see how we've been handling the situation there in the last few weeks?
You know, again, an excellent question. My sense is that in Iraq, you have a situation where the American government has attempted to have it both ways. We support the idea of Kurdish autonomy, provided that we're able to control the direction in which the autonomy develops. So, for example, despite the fact that the Kurds underwent a horrific genocide in the late 80s, they supported the American policy of Iraqi unity throughout the Bush years. They supported a unity government in Baghdad. They participated in the constitution drafting. It's worth pointing out that during the course of the first or the second Iraq War, during the last 10 years, not a single American soldier died in any Kurdish province. Despite that participation, they've been the victims of bombings, they've been the victims of kidnappings, they've been the victims of beheadings. And in recent months, they've been asked to shelter over 1 million of their countrymen in their own area who were fleeing from their own homegrown terrorist movement in other provinces of northern Iraq. So you have to imagine to yourself, how would you feel if a State Department official told you that you lack commitment to Iraq's unity? As a Kurd, how would you feel to hear that statement? I think most listeners would know exactly how they feel, but it's probably not repeatable on the radio. So
Right.
what we're doing with the Kurds is we're on the one hand supporting their autonomy within Iraq in the sense that we did establish the no-fly zone. We did allow them to build a democratic region within Iraq, but on the other hand, we're forcing them to stay married to the system that is clearly failing. And I think it's quite cynical.
So, and cynical in what sense? I mean, there's misguided, there's even stupid or foolish, but how so cynical? Because we don't believe it will work, because we know better,
Well, because it
or
hasn't worked, and it's repeatedly not
Mhm.
worked. And the concept of Iraqi unity is a fiction. It's an American fiction, and it's paid for with Kurdish blood.
Well, one of the and you have said, I don't want to mischaracterize, but my understanding is you've said it's time for an independent Kurdistan. Is that your feeling that's the right solution now?
Well, I believe a couple of months ago, in June, there was an opportunity, briefly, when the Iraqi army collapsed. So, again, context is important here. The Obama strategy to withdraw from Iraq involved sending billions of dollars worth of weaponry to the Iraqi military, which it turns out was little more than another sectarian force in the Middle East. And that military collapsed under the onslaught of the Islamic State, and millions to billions of dollars worth of American military hardware then entered into the hands of terrorists. At
Right.
that moment, the Kurds suddenly, instead of sharing a border with the Iraqi state, realized that they shared most of their border with the Islamic State. And the old definitions of borders in the Middle East suddenly ceased to exist on
Hmm.
the ground. There was an opportunity at that moment, I think, to reorient American policy towards the Kurds, to acknowledge in a creative and proactive way their accomplishments in the area, and to begin orienting foreign policy more towards their empowerment than towards the central government in Baghdad. We chose not to take that opportunity, and I can't tell you what the motivations are of the people. You'd have to ask them yourselves. But we doubled down on the Baghdad strategy as if that whole episode had never happened, as if billions of dollars of American military hardware had not just fallen into the hands of terrorists, as if the policy had not failed so spectacularly on the ground. And we're continuing to double down on that strategy now by sending billions of dollars more weapons to the Iraqi central government. At
So,
the same
all
time,
right,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, at the
I
same
need to
time,
take a break. I'm sorry about that. I need to take a break. When I come back, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the concept of independent Kurdistan. We're talking with Dr. Jonathan Dworkin, who has spent a lot of time and written a great in Kurdistan and Kurdish areas and written a great deal about it. We will be right back with Dr. Dworkin after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. We are talking to Dr. Jonathan Dworkin, who is an infectious diseases specialist who spent a lot of time with the Kurdish people and has been writing about the situation there very eloquently in recent weeks. So before we went to break, Dr. Dworkin, we were talking about the idea of an independent Kurdistan, and you were saying there was an opportunity a couple months ago, which seems to have passed. So where do you think we are now?
Well, I think many of the failures in the Kurdish policy in the last couple of months have been failures of American soft power as opposed to failures of American hard power. This gets at the military theme you were referring to earlier. Um, the United States, I believe, is in the position of bombing right now precisely because there was no strategy on the ground to support the Kurds. The United States, of course, has a vast capability in terms of logistics, in terms of its ability to resupply, in terms of its ability to organize. And none of that has been brought to bear on behalf of the Kurds until very recently and very belatedly. So to give just one example of this, we talked a little bit about how the United States armed a sectarian military in terms of arming the Iraqi army prior to the withdrawal, and how those weapons fell into the wrong hands. Well, that brings us directly back to the military intervention just in the last month or two. We're now in the position of having to bomb our own equipment because we armed the wrong people and it fell into the wrong hands. And then it ended up being used against our Kurdish partners on the ground. But there's other examples as well of America soft power failing. One big example is the policy on Kurdish oil exports. The Kurds, just for some context, are locked in an argument with the Iraqi government about their own export capacity. And they have not received their share of government revenue in several months. This has precipitated a kind of economic crisis in northern Iraq and the Kurdish region. And at precisely that moment, the State Department organized what's essentially a boycott against the Kurdish oil exports, again, on behalf of this concept of Iraqi unity, the idea being that Kurdish oil undermines Iraqi unity. So at exactly the same moment that we're intervening militarily on behalf of the Kurds, we're also strangling them economically with the other hand. And the consequences of this on the ground are very real. I have friends in Suleimania working in hospitals who haven't been paid in months. There's acute fuel shortages. There's over 1 million refugees in their area, and only in the last month or two has that problem began to be dealt with in a serious way. So it's really the failures of American soft power that I think are more profound than the failures of American hard power. And as our incoherent economic and diplomatic strategy undermines our military strategy, we're getting sucked in deeper and deeper and deeper militarily.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree with you more there. And I guess if we try to think for a second about what a coherent diplomatic and economic strategy might look like, I was thinking as we were talking a while back, there was discussion about the concept, and I'm thinking maybe 5 years ago, Dr. Ali Alawi, who was at one point part of the central Iraqi government, and Joe Biden, when he was a candidate for president, we're talking about the concept of devolution, which is, as opposed to complete independence for provinces, creating much more autonomy within a national federation or federated state of some kind. Is it too late to think along those lines? Have things just gotten too polarized, or do you think there could possibly be a Kurdistan province in a decentralized Iraq, and that we should be pushing for that?
Well, for my friends in Kurdistan, autonomy and independence have always been the goal. What the exact balance of that will look like is ultimately up to them. I think the important thing for progressives is to realize that it's not up to Mr. Kerry, it's not up to Mr. Obama, and it's not up to Mr. Erdogan or any other foreign leader to determine their fate.
Well, but I mean, on the other hand, we just as we have empowered al-Maliki, for example,
Hmm.
who govern even as he continued to govern as a very sectarian and divisive leader,
Hmm.
and one could argue contributing to the situation we have today. We can also use our support, our ongoing support, to say we insist on, for example, we're not going to support anyone who doesn't support a constitutional convention that allows all the people of Iraq, including the Kurds, to determine the structure of the government and the fate of their own provinces. I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, as opposed to kind of high-handedly going in and saying this is the structure of
Sure, sure.
your country now, a constitutional convention, if you will.
I think you're getting at a very important idea here. And for me, the way I would express it is that if there's to be any kind of tolerant governance in any part of Iraq or Syria, for that matter, it's going to happen with an empowered Kurdish community. And this is something that I think the Obama people do not get fundamentally. Uh, they're trying to do it without empowering the Kurds and hoping that it works out, but it can't possibly work out because these are our moderate partners on the ground. These are the people that have consistently shown a willingness and ability and effectiveness in working with us. And if there's going to be any possibility of a decent outcome in terms of minority rights, in terms of women's rights, in terms of decentralization of power, it's going to be through their empowerment. And if I had to articulate an American foreign policy, it would be a foreign policy based on their empowerment, not prescriptive, but helpful.
Yeah, I mean, and just as we go into the final phase of our conversation here, I mean, as we talk about it, we're talking with Dr. Jonathan Dworkin, who has spent a lot of time with and thinking about the Kurdish people. As it seems to me that there's kind of three dimensions to this conversation. One is the practical. What can we do to get out of this mess and do the humane thing and the right thing? The other is the moral, in the sense that really, you alluded to it briefly, but the United States has really given a bad deal to the Kurdish people for a long time, going to back to 1991 and the first President Bush saying "rise up," and then arguably leaving them to their fate and to the horrible, gassings and everything else of Saddam Hussein, and then doing that again as they've worked hard to keep the central government together, accusing them of not doing enough even under these circumstances. So I guess there's that moral argument in terms of the United States itself. And then the third dimension of it, maybe we can close with that, is that these people, you've worked among these people, and I know from doing aid work in different countries, you get a sense of a culture and a people. And I think the third aspect of your message is these are good people. I mean, that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, some things are simple, and for me, that's one of them. When I first went to Kurdistan in 2006, it was the height of the Iraq War, and there was all kinds of conflicting advice about whether or not it was safe to travel there. What I realized very quickly is that I was amongst friends. I was able to walk openly through the bazaar in Soleimani. I lived there for 2 months with Kurdish house officers in the hospital in a place called the Dar Nikhoshani, which is the children's hospital where the doctors lived. I rounded with them, I worked with them, and ultimately published a couple of medical papers with them. And when I speak to their goodness, I speak from my direct personal experience.
Well, and I think that's probably the best place to leave it. That look, these are good folks, good people, trying to do the right thing, trying to survive, as you phrased it, surrounded by a sea of hatred and violence. We have not treated them fairly, and we should also be, in treating them fairly, looking for the kind of solution that is more stable for the future. I guess that's the way I'd put it. So, any final thought for us before we break?
No, I appreciate being on the show and taking the time to discuss the issue.
Well, I think it's very important. I appreciate, commend your writing on this. I encourage people to look up your writing, Dr. Jonathan Dworkin. That's Dworkin, writing on the situation in the Kurdish region right now. We'll keep watching. I know you will too. And thanks so much for coming on the program.
Spas Barakum.
Okay. We will be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.